million to train hundreds of young Libyans to become part of the country's future elite. You see the interface of these prestigious schools in training the sons and daughters of the ruling elites of their own and other countries. An independent inquiry headed by Lord Wolfe, a former Lord Chief Justice, will examine the LSE's relationship with Libya and Gaddafi's son. Oh, let's see. His resignation came as a U.S. consultancy, that means a consulting firm, admitted mishandling a multi-million-dollar contract with Libya to sanitize Gaddafi's reputation in the West. Monitor Group, based in Cambridge, Massachusetts, home of Harvard, organized for U.S. and U.K. academics and policymakers to travel to Tripoli to meet the Libyan despot between 2006 and 2008 as part of a $3 million contract. They included, Fernando, you're going to appreciate this, Francis Fukuyama, professor of international political economy at Johns Hopkins University and author of The End of History, which means, you know, don't try to struggle for a better world. We're here, okay? And I hesitate to tell you this, but mention my custom readers. What he didn't tell you is my custom readers are published by Pearson, which is one of the large publishing companies of the world. And reading a separate article on finance about Libya's shifts to economic plan B, I'm reading along, and I get to the part where it says that the Gaddafi family apparently owns about 3% of the stock in the Britain-based Pearson Media Company. I'm thinking, how many Pearsons could there be? Me, linked to Gaddafi? Oh no, don't worry. Anyway, on an optimistic note, as much as the ruling class tries to dull your mind, it does provoke resistance. And people try to figure out, why are we being abused and exploited? But as I said there, before I went off on this bit of a tangent, the greatest problem you have is sectarianism. And I don't mean political or religious differences. What I mean is something far more fundamental that nobody wants to question. It's called nationalism. One of the things that holds workers around the world, the oppressed around the world back, is they say, well, we're going to organize as Americans, we're going to organize as Mexicans, we're going to organize as Libyans, we're going to organize as Egyptians, we're going to organize as Israelis, we're going to organize as Yemenis, we're going to organize as Bangladeshis, no, we're going to organize as Vietnamese. Well, it's true you may have some cultural differences, but modern national identity, keep it down over there, modern national identity is just that. It's modern. It's a social and political construction. And one of its purposes, and one of its certain most pernicious effects, is to get people to think in terms of nationality, to see themselves as members of nations instead of classes. And if you see yourself as a member of the nation, you're not going to be thinking, you're always going to put the class interest back. If I was in the ruling class, that's precisely what I would want. Because if you think in class interest, you'll think how you are different from me. I hope that was a good photo. I was trying to time it. If you think in terms of nationality, you'll be thinking, oh, I'm just like my boss. Well, not just like, but we have something in common. We're both Americans. Let me illustrate what I mean by telling you a little story I tell my students. I walk into class sometimes and I say to my students, I'm going to prove to you that the French are stupid. And, you know, given the American stereotype of French, you know, it kind of perks people up. You know, they quit looking at Facebook and they pay attention for a while. And I said, look, in France, you have class structure. You have a minority of the population owning most of the means of production, the factories, the lands, and so on and so forth, most of the wealth. And that ruling class wants more for economic reasons we don't need to go into. And to get more, it will go to other countries. So, for example, in the late 1800s, the French ruling class wanted Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. But it's not like the Vietnamese were, calling up and saying, hey, why don't you come over and take over the country? We'll give it to you. That didn't happen. So the French had to send a navy and an army over. But who was in the army and navy? French workers, the sons of French workers. The sons of the French elite weren't going to be in the army and navy. And so thousands of French kids died so that the French ruling class and its companies like Michelin could get Vietnam and establish rubber plantations, turn the rice economy into an global export product or economy. And when the Vietnamese rebelled, more sons of the French working class were sent to die for the French ruling class. Who got the profits from the exploitation of Vietnam? The French ruling class. And those Vietnamese elites that they co-opted and bound in political economic relationships. And who paid the price besides the exploited Vietnamese peasant? French military personnel, soldiers and sailors who died. And you know what? The French did it in one generation back in the 1870s and 80s, then they turned around and they did it again. And when the Vietnamese rebelled after World War II, the French sent troops in and French workers, or rather the sons of French workers, died for the French ruling class again. And then when the Vietnamese beat the French and the French had to leave, the Algerians rose in revolt. And the French elite said, we just lost Vietnam, like heck if we're going to lose Algeria. And so another 8 years was spent trying to subdue Algeria. And again, the sons of French workers died so the French elite could have Algeria. In the end, they failed. But how stupid is that? Why would you send your kid to die for the very class that exploits you? Don't have class consciousness. Well, you wouldn't if you loved your kid. But there is a reason why. Because French nationalism clouds everything. It fogs up your brain. And now you say, oh, we must fight for France. The glory of France. And France is on a civilizing mission for the poor Vietnamese and Algerians. Now you get the French workers all confused. Oh, they're not doing it for their exploiters. They're doing it for the French nation, the French people. And they're also helping out the Vietnamese and Algerians because they are on a civilizing mission. Today you don't use that expression, you call it exporting democracy and protecting human rights. But nationalism is is the fog in your brain that gets in the way of class analysis. This is why you get weak-kneed when you want to oppose war. And then somebody says, are you for this country or aren't you? Which brings me to the topic I said I would conclude with, Islamophobia. Like, I thought George Bush made it clear, Islam is not the problem. All of a sudden, it's like, well, shortly after, Islam becomes the problem. And year after year, Islam is the problem, and the problem, and the problem. Now, if you know me, you know I'm not a Muslim, but you're my students, I've known you for years. As far as I can tell, you're not a problem. Okay, maybe your grades could have been a little better. You should have done a little more, work on that homework there. But, it's like, okay, it's like, we'll ignore that. Well, what is going on here? So my first reaction was, aha! Those wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, they're going to go on for a while longer, and you know what? There's problems over there in Yemen, and there's problems in Iran, and why Saudi Arabia could be under threat, and so on and so forth. So the Americans are going to be involved a long time. And who lives over there? What's the predominant religious belief? Islam. So one of the ways you can get some soldiers all gung-ho is like, dude, you know why we're sending you there, Billy? You knew Billy was going to get in. It's because Islam is the danger. And you know who's over there? That's where the Muslims are. So pay attention in boot camp. So I thought, okay, Islamophobia is partly about getting young Americans and this actually has been going on for about a generation. If you lived my life, you would grow up without any Islamophobia. You had commophobia. Okay? I grew up, you know, on the fear of the communist. You know. And it wasn't until around the 1980s I noticed that, like, we're not really talking about the communists anymore that much, except for Russia. It's like, no, Vietnam's over, Korea's been over a long time. All of a sudden, the propaganda shifts. Movies start to come out with the fanatical Arab terrorist, you know, Richard cuts out with a knife, but, you know, Charles Schwarzenegger's there. Or Arnold Schwarzenegger. Charles, what's his name? Chuck Norris. Anyway, so then I noticed all of a sudden, now there's all this propaganda against Muslims, and it's just kind of steady, low-key thing. But it seems to have ratcheted up, you know, and it's still there. And I'm going, and like, why is this still here? It's not just about getting Billy ready to go off to the Middle East. Something else is going on. And then it hit me. Islamophobia is partly a way to control Muslims in America, not just the non-Muslim population. Okay, well, partly, you know, to make the non-Muslim population just a little bit. You're a what? Excuse me. I don't know if I should be seen talking to you. So part of Islamophobia is to control the non-Muslim population, make them scared of Muslims. The other thing is to put Muslims in their place. It's a way of saying, you want to live here in America? Prove to me that you're loyal to America. That you are a Muslim American.